Am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Right. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. As a member of a country that used to be in the Western Balkans, but is now proudly European, I'm so proud to stand in opening government. Just 2 things to clear up. First of all, what does it mean to continue the process? It means to continue current efforts towards countries closer to joining the EU, such as Serbia or Montenegro, but also being proactive towards countries further away from it, such as Bosnia, also working to resolve regional crises, such as the one in Kosovo. Our burden of proof is not to show that these countries will join the European Union, just that the process in and of itself brings benefits. Starting with that, the first thing I want to prove is why do countries have an incentive to participate in the process of negotiation with the EU, opening negotiation chapters and fulfilling EU conditionality. Anything closing governments may run will necessarily have to be predicated on this. So if I prove this, they're already derivative before they've spoken. That's quite convenient for us. 7 mechanisms here. First of all, optical incentives. Not a lot of these countries have trauma tied to the former Eastern Bloc. They were all members of Yugoslavia or the Eastern Bloc more broadly, such as Albania under Enver Hoxha. They perceived the Eastern Bloc to have been politically and identitarianly oppressive. They were not able to express who they are. They did not access political freedom such as democracy and voting, which is to say that the part of the identity building post the Eastern Bloc is to claim that we belong to civilized Europe as opposed to the backward and communist East. People want to belong to the West as a symbol of a new hope as opposed to the times they remember through transgenerational trauma. Secondly, the perception of life always having been better in the West. Now that during the Eastern Bloc, a large amount of people emigrated to countries like West Germany and sent remittances home, which is to say that there was always a feeling of relative deprivation towards the life in the West. Insofar as this is transgenerationally transmitted from older generations to younger generations, it persists, but it's also preemptive to anything coming out of the opposition in terms of backlash from the older generations, which might be their strongest content. The third mechanism is investor signaling. Insofar as this conditionality, even if you don't join, means reforms of the legal system. It means you have separation of powers, better contract enforcement, but also efforts to transition to market capitalism where legal actions are clearer and less corrupt, which means that investors are more likely to be confident about investing in these countries overall, which means that you're able to get financial benefits which strengthen your political role. Fourthly, it's political prestige. You want to be the party that opened the negotiations, or you want to be the party that joined the EU because over time that reinforces your legitimacy. Not these countries have a huge amount of parties which were formed after the Eastern Bloc, still relatively young, 20 or 30 years. They don't have political tradition, meaning they want to build up political tradition long-term to build up legitimacy. Fifthly, the perception of being tied to the West. Not only is the West considered to be the more affluent, more politically stable part of the world, therefore inviting FDI, but it also means that EU projects which go through these countries are more likely to be approved. Not projects like the South Stream gas pipeline project, which countries like Serbia could have extracted taxes and tariffs from, were stopped because these countries were perceived to be closer to Russia than the European Union, meaning the European Union considered this to be a geopolitical risk. Sixthly, it's regional rivalry. Note that a lot of us versus them narrative, specifically because there was a war in a large amount of these countries, Serbia intervening in Kosovo in 1999, but also the Yugoslav wars starting in 1991. A lot of the identity us versus them narratives are based on the idea of comparing yourself to another nation and asserting civilizational dominance, like we are older, first there was the Serbs, then there was the amoeba and single cell organism and things like this, which is to say that Croatia and Slovenia used to be Western Balkans, but no longer are. Croatia is about to adopt the euro, Slovenia already has, which means there's an optical perception that these countries are doing better than Serbia or better than Bosnia, which makes people pissed off and is also a very easy way for politicians to rationalize why they're negotiating with the EU. But lastly, just the benefits of the EU in general, if you end up joining, are good enough for you to want to pursue them in the long term, which is to say things like access to the free trade area, meaning that you're better able to access goods and services for your people, but it's also easier for you to export. It also means access to EU development funds in various areas like the green transition, all of these things that might be necessary insofar as oil and gas are exhaustible resources, etc. Note that you have regional proof that the process pays off. It took Croatia 22 or somewhat years, but they did join. It took Slovenia, I don't know how much, but they did join, which is to say that you have visible proof that the process pays off overall. This shows that the countries are going to cooperate, which it also provides a huge amount of reasons why backlash is not going to happen. But even if they still try to claim backlash, know that this is just continuing the process, not strengthening it or whatever. So the backlash has already happened insofar as it would happen. Why is the process good? First of all, because during the process, you get investment in infrastructure, which is to say European Union often does bilateral tit-for-tat deals. You fulfill X chapter, we build a railroad or we build a school. Not only is this good for the country overall, but it also reinforces pro-EU sentiment, because if you see a school with an EU flag in front of it, that's a visible proof that EU is good. Also reinforces our mechanisms as to why countries cooperate. Secondly, there's more oversight. EU officials on the ground doing things like overseeing elections. this increases people's agency over their destiny. The way to control your destiny is to control the state insofar as the state controls you. Thirdly, it's democratization. So part of these conditions are things like the separation of powers, ensuring that people have access to an independent judiciary and to follow their concerns versus the state. Know that Croatia gave up its generals to The Hague, an important part of the post-conflict reconciliation process, because the European Union forced us to do this. But fourthly, it's human rights and minority rights push is incredibly important in multi-ethnic states. The European Union pushed Serbia and Croatia to create policies for multilingual schooling in areas where there were Croatian and Serbian minorities as part of the conditionality. Insofar as we already took a path dependency, we said we wanted to be pro-European, we had to deliver on this as politicians, which means if we back down, if this will mean lost political capital, which is why we adopted these kinds of policies, means better lives for minorities overall. The process in and of itself is good. I don't have to prove that they join. I also want to talk about geopolitics. The European Union is going to diffuse a large amount of geopolitical problems. First of all, there's a disincentive for countries to inflame conflict. For example, note that the Republic of Srpska, which is a Serbian parastate in Bosnia, is trying to foment war in Bosnia currently. The reason why they won't is because official Serbia won't support them. The reason why they won't support them is because the EU is going to oppose Serbia, and Serbia has been on the path to joining the European Union. These countries have a disincentive to prevent conflicting and warring parties in that region. Before I move on to the other reasons why that's good, I'll take closing opposition.
Why, despite many years motions like this have been around, Serbia is still farther than it has ever been to get into the EU?
It's not further than has ever been to the EU. Aleksandar Vučić, a Serbian president, has never been as pro-EU as he is currently, which is to say Serbia is shifting its rhetoric towards the European Union as opposed to against it, specifically because Russia is currently acting out. You don't want to be perceived on their side. Secondly, we said this creates initiative to resolve conflicts. For example, the Kosovo crisis, which currently just has a large amount of civil conflict, a large amount of people dying there in firefights because the country wants independence. Insofar as the EU mandates things like resolving border issues, this means that we're more likely to get things like Kosovo recognition and resolving that conflict in the region. But thirdly, it just means diffusing tension overall, because insofar as individuals see that they can get visual benefits out of the European Union, we lose the appeal of identitarian us versus them rallying. It most often comes in situations of crisis where we need someone to blame. If Bosnia, for example, gets more schools, if Bosnia gets more investment, then there's less fighting in Bosnia about who is Croat and who is Bosniak, and less people dying on the streets. Not to mention that the European Union being stronger in these countries means you have a countervailing incentive to China and Russia, which means at least that these countries become less energy dependent on Russia because the EU can trade them its own energy because it's energy independent, but also China has to offer them better deals insofar as the European Union is now a competitor in the area. So if nothing else, even if the EU is not a good in and of itself, it increases their choice and incentivizes countries to give them better deals. But lastly, this just gives people hope. If people think that their country's situation is going to change, if they think they can join Europe, this means they're more likely to do things like take out a loan, send their child to college. They're more likely to go out and vote because they perceive a chance of change. They're more likely to do good things for themselves in their lives because they think that there's a chance that their country might improve in the future. For all of those reasons, I'm very proud to stand in opening government.
Excuse me. I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the leader of opposition. You're here.
Great. Can I confirm I'm clearly audible?
You are.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm not going to contest, Tim, that countries in the Western Balkans have every incentive to engage in negotiations. I just think it's been a massive waste of money that the EU has pissed away on countries that are no closer to joining than they were 12 years ago, and the terminal impact of accession would be really bad for the EU. 4 claims in opening opposition. Firstly, why the process of accession will go poorly. Secondly, economics, why the negotiation and eventual accession increases financial risk within the EU. Thirdly, why this amplifies political division within the EU. Finally, geopolitics. First, a laundry list of things that are not in this debate. Firstly, war. The EU will oppose war by secessionary groups in Republic of Srpska regardless because they do not want a war and the resultant financial contagion on their borders either way. They have every incentive to do this regardless of whether or not they continue the accession process. Secondly, Chinese investment. The United States, European NGOs, and private corporations from the West will always have a concern that Chinese investment is growing, even if it is not a political concern, it is an economic one. Therefore, China has to offer preferential loans to Serbia regardless because they will be competing with the West for contracts in either world. This is why they continue to offer contracts despite the process being stalled. They do have to stand behind some degree of marginal increase. Finally, the last thing not in the debate, the idea that they can continue status quo. Tin himself frames that, yes, they can continue the accession process, but also claims that it likely means they have to increase the level of aid and incentives for these countries to join. This isn't like expenditure they have to buy on their side of the house. Let's talk about the enlargement process that it looked like. This largely looked like a process of negotiation between the EU and Western Balkan states. That is the EU imposing a series of conditions on the Western Balkans in order for accession to happen. In the case of North Macedonia, this was resolving the name change dispute with Greece over the name Macedonia. In the case of Serbia, it would likely be democratic reforms. It would likely be Hague tribunals. It would likely be economic reforms to bring the countries more in line with EU free market capitalism. The reason why the accession process is stalled in the status quo is because the countries have not committed to these reforms in terms of corruption. They have not committed to abolishing patronage networks. They have not committed to disclosing the dark money that flows in from sources like China and other private investors. They either need to stand behind letting these countries get into the EU unreformed, which is not likely to happen, or prove the conditions are likely to work. I posit that conditions won't. And now here's why I'm going to outframe Tin and his 7 mechanisms as to why they have incentives to participate. We'll concede that, sure, they have an incentive to participate in the process. I think this process is likely to play out really poorly. Before I do that, let's clear up the condition stuff, because it's not clear that every state will be receptive to negotiations. Sure, the majority of Bosnians might, but there are economic elites within Serbia who are often older and within these countries who benefit from the status quo and would see their power sharply curtailed if they had to meet the economic and political reforms necessary to abolish those types of patronage networks and to reduce the power. These people tend to be old because they have a great degree of economic capital and have the time through age to accumulate that capital. This won't happen as a result in many of these countries, or at least has the incentive to stall it, which is why this has not happened for years. Secondly, even if these political and economic elites would be willing to accede in theory, many of their constituents and benefactors within patronage networks, i.e. China, which has embedded itself significantly within Serbian patronage networks, are unlikely to want to let them. And insofar as those are the people currently paying for them, even if they in theory had the incentive to align with the EU, it's probably the case that they would not. But more importantly, let's just concede and say, the negotiations will happen and they will continue. Why are these negotiations bad? In the process of imposing the conditions and negotiating surrounding the conditions, it is unclear that these states comply in good faith. They can just take a lot of money unconditionally from China while dragging out the negotiation process and forcing the EU to commit real and tangible resources toward accession. This is what they have been doing while Euroscepticism has been brewing at massive rates within its own borders. You have parties like the PIS in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary growing at massive rates due to discontent because the EU has failed to ameliorate real economic harms due to the coronavirus and due to other harms within its own borders. I think allocating those resources toward these other things would be a significantly better use of their capital. But even if the EU doesn't do that, just the optical benefit of not allocating resources toward countries that are not any closer to being admitted in the EU after 12 years is unlikely to be a benefit. Secondly, as a result of imposing these conditions, it's likely to amplify discord between the states. Because if the EU prioritizes Serbia, who for whatever reason, Tin says, might move faster along the process of meeting the conditions than say Bosnia, whose accession process has been stalled far longer than Bosnia's, this would likely amplify dissent and discord within those states. Insofar as political backlash is bad, that's probably harmful. Insofar as that pisses off the older generation, there probably is a degree of extreme backlash, right? Because you are probably literally giving up individuals to investigations that would happen at international criminal courts, for instance. You are likely to, at the very least, be robbing a large numbers of elites of their power in the status quo. This likely does mean there would be a degree of backlash insofar as the negotiations look like they're going to be successful, but I have no idea why they would negotiate in good faith. What are the impacts? Firstly, in terms of resource trade-off, you get lots of money and time going toward an accession process whose success is speculated and whose benefits are unclear at the expense of aid to extant member states. Secondly, in terms of specific harms, you probably do get differential levels of backlash, not just as a result of elites are mad and they get angry about this, and there is likely some degree of discontent within the populace, which does lead to protests, does lead to economic harms of those protests being successful and realized and generating political capital for those. But more importantly, you get backlash between the different states insofar as the EU has to fast track some of these states and put the others on the slow track depending on the degree to which they're willing to meet differential levels of reform. Secondly, economic harms. I'm going to do this in two ways. First, I'm going to explain why the process of accession is bad. The process of accession is bad because it's expensive and the EU is in a lot of shit right now. Inflation is rising rapidly, and this is not good because it reduces purchasing power. That makes it harder for individuals within the EU to buy goods and feed their families. On a gut check, the reason why you weigh this over the benefits of potential speculative benefits of accession on their side is because these harms are happening now and the benefits of accession are speculative. When you spend money on this, this trades off with economic aid to existing member states that the EU is likely to allocate towards insofar as they no longer have this additional expenditure. They're already giving money in Eastern Europe generally, and these states are calling out for further funding. What this does on their side is amplifies Euroscepticism, because leaders in Poland and Hungary have seen this and have generated political capital off of this to fundraise for Eurosceptic things. Euroscepticism is bad, not just because countries leave the EU or want to leave the EU, but because the perception that they are growing undermines investor confidence and shrinks the political leverage the EU has against other actors like Russia and China in general. Secondly, if they accede, it amplifies risk. Before I explain why that terminal impact is bad, I'll take closing government.
The comparative is worse on your side of the house because currently the EU is giving money towards these countries but have zero accountability mechanisms to make them fix their problems currently. So you have the carrot, but you don't have the stick.
No, on the other side of the house, we have every incentive to mitigate worst case harms. On our side of the house, we ameliorate risk within the EU, which stabilizes the country, which affects a much larger number of people. On our side of the house, I am perfectly willing to concede that these countries are not admitted into the EU. I just think it is better for a larger number of people that they are not. If they accede, it amplifies risk, right? Because these countries have large numbers of structural problems, whether these are political problems like crony capitalism under Vučić in Serbia with patronage networks, or North Macedonia, where Vomer has been like engaging in democratic backsliding against the government for a significant period of time. But note also these economies, which largely depend on tourism, were hit hard by COVID, and their large tourism sector was virtually killed by this. What this means at the point at which you amplify risk within the union by admitting states that have not fulfilled a variety of economic conditions, but at the very least are structurally reliant on EU funds to meet those conditions over a long period of time, this likely does mean investors pull out of the EU. But more importantly, insofar as these countries are more liable to economic shocks down the line, you incentivize the EU to have to give massive bailouts if they later on default on Chinese debt that they cannot pay off, and they have to continue to incentivize support for them. I think Greece was bad, and the 2008 response to this was terrible. I think imposing more austerity in these countries likely leads to more backlash within those regions, probably forces them to pivot to China to a greater extent, and probably is quite harmful. Finally, it just amplifies political division in the EU. I already talked about Euroscepticism, but insofar as this increases EU dependency on China massively because of these extant political ties to these countries, I think that's probably bad for the EU's independence as an organization. Nord Stream 2 is pretty shit. Proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Cool, am I audible?
Yeah.
Fabulous. Opening opposition gave some pretty decent responses to a case that we did not run. Let's just run through what they've said. So the first thing to say, and this is just a blanket response to all of their analysis about how this perceptually changes things within the European Union and stuff in general. We're not increasing anything. We're just continuing a process that has already started. They say, oh, we need to continue doing things. Yes, but there's no rate of increase in the stuff we're doing. You have to do more things. That's what it means to continue doing a process. So all of their material on things like Euroscepticism and speculative investment, etc., are unlikely to be actually that comparative if they change the extremely marginal thing compared to the things that we run. The other thing then, and this is in terms of a broad response to their case, is that they respond to a lot of the reasons, they give a lot of reasons why they won't actually join the EU, and therefore it's not a big thing. But all of our mechanisms are reasons why the process in and of itself will be good. Sure, if they join the European Union, that'd be good because they get access to a free market and things like free flow of remittances and that kind of thing. But all of our impacts were all contingent on just the process itself happening. So even if they never joined the European Union, we would still be winning the top half of this debate. Let's move through their case now independently. Starting off with the process in and of itself. They say that it's been stalled and people haven't committed. I think this is broadly speaking an assertion, but here's some other countervailing claims. North Macedonia has changed its name despite, the meaning, like the meaning thing that they talk about. Montenegro has adopted the EU as a currency, even though they haven't joined yet. The Serbian government has appointed, an LGBT prime minister in an effort to increase representation. The average informed voter has probably heard of one of these things, and therefore they know that opening opposition are lying. The next thing to say then is they say, oh, well, there's a problem because people who are complicit in previous crimes or have been engaged in corruption are likely to be opposed to this. Several responses to this. The first to say is that actually, interestingly, the EU is less likely to be punitive in how they engage in reconciliation efforts post-conflict within this area, which is to say the domestic political pressures oftentimes want things like punishment. They want people drawn up to courts. They want people hanged and executed, essentially. But within the European Union, these kinds of norms have moved away because we've seen how they've worked out problematically within the past, which means you're more likely to get things like amnesty given to people on condition that they say, where the bodies were buried, what they did during the war, etc., etc. This A leads to better reconciliation, but it's B also the reason why these specific people, if they do have the power of opening opposition claim, are likely to be in support of this as a process. We also gave reasons why the older generations are likely to be in favor of this because of stories they've heard from their cousins or their brothers and sisters who emigrated previously, because of Cold War propaganda funneled in by the West during the Cold War. It means they're likely to perceive this as being a very good move for them. They say that it will increase geopolitical tensions within the region, but the problem is we preempted this argument because if a particular country like Serbia is on a faster track, the way in which other countries in that area compete with them within international or regional prestige is to increase their own processes of liberalization such that they can enter into the EU first or speed up the process in that thing. We already preempted that material overall. They say that the constituents won't want it because they get dirty money from China and stuff like that. The problem is we preempt this argument by explaining how it will be the case that this makes China have to compete more with these kinds of things, and they can't hold them to account if they are, as they say, under the table deals. They can do these kinds of dealings overall. They say that overall this won't change because China is already investing, but the problem here is that when you change something, it reaches a different equilibrium. So even if there is incentives against Chinese investment, now the equilibrium of it gets much, much lower, which means they have to increase the value of these things. So there are better trade deals, better bilateral trade agreements, better loans given out to these countries overall, and they're competing against European Union loans and Western loans in general, because we've explained how this is a positive signal to other countries within those areas. They say that, oh, they won't comply with these kinds of regulations and stuff like that. But the problem is that the EU is pumping money into these areas in status quo, potentially more as it enters into the future, because this process already exists. But when you continue doing this process, you can now start putting boots on the ground to hold them to account. You need to start meeting these kinds of criteria and signals and indicators that you will be a more liberal, more democratized, and a better human rights and more civil rights country within the future. So now you have the ability to actually hold them to account when you know that there is the fear that the EU can pull out or start prioritizing other countries in this process, expediting them at your expense, which means you're more likely to comply on our side of the house. Well, innately you're more likely to comply because you're not doing anything on opposition's side of the house. We also explain, and they say that this is, expensive for the European Union and will lead to Euroscepticism. Here's the problem, though. In the wake of Brexit and Britain leaving the EU now needs to be able to display its ability to leverage soft power over countries within regional and international things. The reason this then becomes important is now that the EU is able to show a power projection over what is perceived to be a regional, like a regional neighbor, they're now able to increase their legitimacy in potentially Eurosceptic countries. It's also unclear why, Viktor Orban has this as a meaningful delta insofar as, populist leaders are not necessarily tied to the truth in any sort of particular way. So even if they can't say the EU is going to let Serbia in and that's bad, they can say things like the EU has a, global homosexual agenda and that's bad. It's unclear what the actual difference is in that kind of point. They're not tied to truth in that specific way. And also this process has already happened. So it's old hat news within those countries. It's unlikely to be that important overall. I think other than that, they say it's going to be expensive, but the problem is the EU recovered quicker from COVID than other countries. It's also a more stable thing because the European Central Bank has been able to do effective monetary and fiscal policy to recover from these things better. And also, here's something really important. There is regional trade between these countries and the EU anyway, which leads to an element of contagion between those things. When they're more likely to be able to leverage controls through the process on these countries, but also if at the point they join within these countries, they're more able to effectively leverage fiscal policy within those countries. It's more likely to be accepted in those countries because you can also load the blame onto the European Union by saying, it is them that have imposed austerity on us, and actually get financial recovery in times of shock, which means that the material and investment there flips on their side of the house because it's now perceived as being a more secure investment to invest in both this region and the European Union and Eastern Europe in general. Before we move on, I'll take a closing.
So for a while, Turkey has tried to democratize when it thought it had a chance to get into the EU, but then when they got fucked, they just got worse because they hated the EU and the West and went in the other direction. What would prevent that this time?
But the problem is that, that's just essentially just an assertion. I don't have the time to deal with the specific geopolitical things within Turkey. I think it's not worth my time. Now, moving on. In terms of weighing this contribution, I think with regards to our closing team, note that all of our mechanisms that we've provided sufficiently prove the case that we are trying to run, which is that it becomes better for these countries overall, even just during the process. And that is why any additional mechanization on points that we've already presented is unlikely to be persuasive, even if they're, more in number. Furthermore, even if they were to prove that these countries will join, and that would be positive, note we've already given some reasons why that's likely to be good, but also we have a lower burden of proof for our arguments because we explain why the process itself is likely to be positive overall. Dealing then with opposition, I think opposition's claims are largely hung on an assertion as to how this will be perceived when we've provided sufficient material to explain why it's unlikely to be a large-scale perceptual change, but what actually does change is people on the ground in terms of their hope, their likelihood to stay in their country and build up a future there, their likelihood to do things like investing in college education for their children, that kind of thing. All these things become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which therefore means they're more likely to meet their criteria and enter into the EU and have exogenous benefits in and of itself. Consequently, then, opening government has won this debate.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hi, sorry, I don't think I mentioned this before. I don't consent to recording, if that's okay.
Cool. Speaker for the fine. Good to know. I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the Member of Government. Here.
Please offer POIs exclusively in the chat. It is nonsense for OG to say that just because we prove that countries might join, CG is going to be derivative. The problem with opening government is way too much on why they might join, not enough on why if they join, there are actually going to be benefits. We're going to run 2 extensions in closing government. The first is going to be answering Hadar's POIs. What is different now? Why are these countries going to join when there's previously been a lag? And our second contribution will be a myriad of benefits that are going to occur to the wider EU and these countries domestically when they join. On the first thing of answering Hadar's POIs, so I think that Tin gives a bunch of like theoretical reasons about why these countries might join because they're nostalgic about the West, blah, 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 which like might sound true in debate land, but it's deeply unclear given the like factual context that CEO points out why when they're happy in accession processes, these countries have not joined yet. So the first thing that I want to answer is what is different now? So the way that leaders in the Western Balkans sustain political legitimacy is via an artificial social contract where they improve people's quality of life or pledge to, which is what enables them to limit democratic freedoms because people are okay with some more limited democracy in exchange for a variety of benefits. I think, however, that this contract is becoming more unstable in the Western Balkans for 2 reasons. The first is that COVID is harming the economy within a lot of states, which is making it more difficult for them to deliver a variety of economic goods to people on the ground. It's doing things like leading to subsidy cuts and a decline of the welfare state. Secondly, though, the longer that these countries are excluded from the EU, the higher the economic costs get for them. The reason for this is that the EU basically creates an investment drain where new states like Croatia who are joining the EU are able to latch on to the increased credibility of the EU. More countries are doing things like moving to the euro, which is a more stable currency. So the more countries who join and you are excluded, the less evenly distributed that benefits are throughout Europe, meaning that increasingly these leaders are going to get in trouble. So effectively, a lot of these political leaders are in an increasingly precarious position. This then leads to 2 things. Firstly, there has been the rise of a higher number of opposition groups within these states who advocate for joining the EU. But secondly, leaders themselves are in trouble. Now, I think that OO gives a smart response that OG doesn't respond to of why would leaders make democratic reforms when this can literally lead them to being ousted. Note, OG does not respond to this. We say is leaders are in a politically precarious position if they don't join the EU. Yes, they have patronage networks, but these patrons are getting unhappy because they're not being like economically fulfilled to enough of an extent. And there's rising opposition to rival the patrons. So therefore, what ends up happening is that these leaders are going to be willing to take a gamble. They're going to be willing to democratize and make some reforms in exchange for the bet that when they enter into the EU and improve people's quality of life, they're going to deliver a higher number of goods to people on the ground, and therefore they're going to be able to keep winning elections over time. So that's how we solve the OO response. And note that the more that leaders like Vučić do crack down, this also decreases popularity as well. The second observation I want to make is that I don't think that on Gov we have to defend the status quo. I do think that processes have lulled a bit. I think that we can reignite them. We can have things like more deadlines for negotiations being bumped forward, and therefore that deals with that POI as well. The second POI is like, why will countries follow through? I think that the answer to this is that starting accession processes creates a form of path dependency that ultimately exists. Leaders like Vučić that need to make political arguments to justify why they're engaging in these kind of EU accession processes. If they try and go back from that in the future, they're going to appear to be massively ideologically contradictory, increasing their propensity for forms of call-outs. So I actually think that we here are logically prior to opening government by offering more plausible reasons over why there is a chance that these countries are actually going to accede. Before we get into our second extension about why these countries joining is good, I'll take a POI from opening.
On either side of the house, there are exogenous economic factors which promote some degree of liberalization. The problem is when you amplify Euroscepticism within the EU, you never get the chance for the accession process to happen because the
promise I'm going to respond to Euroscepticism right now. So our second extension is why these countries joining is good. I just want to make a couple of framing observations here. So OG, like if these countries join, it's unclear why that is an inherent good relative to harms of populism that I'm actually going to respond to in that way. But secondly, even if they get their positive internal reforms in the short term, it's unclear why those reforms are going to be lasting and sustainable. So on populism and then our positive material, I really don't think that worsening populism has a delta. I think that populism is used by opportunistic leaders who want to cement power, and they have a bajillion other justifications. They can talk about the immigrants who are stealing jobs. They can talk about the like non-political institutions of the EU who are violating forms of democratic rights. I don't think that one more piece of rhetoric in their arsenal is going to have any impacts, but furthermore, I'm going to continue to outframe it by showing why there's actually going to be benefits for the wider EU. So our first claim on the benefits of country joining is this will actually help the remainder of the EU. The first is that trade increases. So there currently are FTAs, but tariffs are not as deep as the tariffs that exist between EU states internally. The EU does import a lot of goods from the Western Balkans when it comes to things like machinery and appliances, base metals and chemicals, and they're now able to do that at cheaper costs. Secondly, more free movement of labor. unemployment in certain Western European states is better able to be facilitated where labor shortages within Eastern Europe can be better fulfilled, where you now have people going in. The third thing to say is that over time, these countries can give tax money. In the short term, yes, it might be dependent on subsidies, but what you end up getting is the building up of like internal domestic industries. The final observation that I want to make here is that internally within the Western Balkans, economic policies are often bad. They're often run by politicians who have cronies in these industries who are not making meritocratic decisions. I think it's good to have the European Central Bank deciding economic policy within these countries, which is far more meritocratic and prevents things like massive debt being taken out. The reason why this helps the entirety of the EU is because, as we've established, there's trade deals under the status quo. Yes, they're not as deep, meaning that there already is some economic integration that exists. By stabilizing markets, by giving more control to the ECB, you end up creating a trickle-down benefit to markets in the rest of the EU via economic stabilization, which is why populism is not going to worsen in the long term. Secondly, on foreign policy, I think that there is a danger that countries are going to pivot to Russia in the absence of this, which is why like Puljić has admittedly made some remarks about turning toward Russia. The reason why this change is not some vague OT mechanism about internal reforms, rather it's literally when you join the EU, do you know who controls your foreign policy? The EU. And it's often done on the basis of unanimity. What this means is that a country like Serbia cannot just unilaterally decide to host a Russian base because they literally lack the capacity to do so. And if they try, Russia has other, not Russia, the EU has other sticks when it can come to things like rolling back development aid and stagnating further integration like joining the euro. This is really important because this will allow more Russian penetration near the EU's border. Even if these countries aren't a part of the EU, if Russia did things like station more bases or stage military exercises, this could make forms of invasions, which are clearly a risk under the status quo, a lot more plausible. They could also do things like just exert pressure to stop forms of economic relationships between the Western Balkans and the rest of the EU, like the current agreement that exists between Bulgaria and Serbia. Finally, on internal reforms. So the first is that countries are subjected to the European Court of Justice, which they often do implement because of very, very strong implementation norms, but also not these countries can be fined, i.e. what happened with Poland. The ECJ often rules in ways with very strong rights guarantees when it comes to things like minorities, which is hugely beneficial for women. Secondly, though, more extremist parties in these countries will have to moderate when they're near running in European parliamentary elections. So if they want to win and join a coalition like the EPP is literally threatening to expel Fidesz because of their radicalism. I'm pretty sure that they did. So you're likely to get an internal moderation of domestic political parties so that they're able to be included and actually win. Finally, the EU just has a bunch of sticks when it comes to things like withdrawing funding if oppression is too bad. Even if one or two countries join, we prove that that's a massive benefit and actually fulfill the gov burden. Very proud to stand in closing government.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the member of opposition. You're here.
Okay, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Sometimes if you love someone, you need to let them go. Our case is really simple. No one likes a teaser. Essentially, the EU has been playing with the hearts of the Western Balkans for quite a while when they don't actually ever intend to take them in. Even if they do, it's going to be in so many decades from now. And by that point, it is more likely for the Balkans to have frustration and resentment towards the EU rather than actually join them and do all of the benefits that governments want them to have. Few pieces of external rebuttal, but most of it will be integrated. First, just a small but technical thing to what Naomi said about, we can have a lot of things that we didn't have so far, like negotiation deadlines to solve the problem of this being too slow. This isn't a policy debate, so no, you can't, because it doesn't exist and you need to support something that happens in the status quo. Secondly, with regards to the entirety of the analysis on like from a CG on why we're likely to get many benefits from like why these countries get benefits from joining the EU, I'm happy to concede this. Joining the EU is great. I don't know why UK ever changed its mind about it, but I think the biggest thing is it's contingent on proving that this joining will actually happen. And here I want to point out the biggest thing. Like 90% at least of the analysis from both governments and why union is likely to happen is from the side of the Balkans, explaining why the Balkans are likely to make all kinds of concessions, why the Balkans really want to and will stand a lot to benefit from it. This sounds true, but it takes two for tango. Note how there's zero analysis, or almost zero analysis. I'll get to the few that there is, okay? on why the EU will take them. I'll get to the few that they gave in a second, which is kind of crucial because proving just one side wants to get in isn't enough, and they cannot fiat that the EU will take them in an analysis debate. The biggest reason we got on the other side as to why the EU does maybe want the Balkans to join is something around the lines, I think it was mostly in PM's speech, on A, they have some stuff they stand to gain from trade with them as well, and B, some influence because, you know, Russia, NATO, stuff like that. Here's the issue. The West and the EU have learned quite well that they can get all of these benefits without needing to take a country into the EU. They can have trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements with countries, which they already do in Eastern Europe. They can gain allyships and influence and even do things such as place NATO missile bases in Ukraine without giving it anything near a guarantee of ever joining. So we don't know why, in order to get any of the benefits they stand, quote unquote, to gain from these countries, they actually need to join them to the EU. When they are on the stronger side of the negotiation, because they are the bigger union with more power and money and influence, they probably can get most of these benefits anyway, and are not likely to just, for this reason, accept these countries. Why do we think the EU is extremely unlikely then to want to have these countries join? One, we think that especially post-COVID, the EU really wants unity in its way of handling budgets and getting out of crisis. This is something that taking or being more willing to accept countries from the Western Balkans is problematic too, in two senses. The first is it would split them up internally because there's no consensus within the EU on whether or not it's a good idea, with some countries being for and some countries being against. But secondly, because it would also harm unity once you take eventually these countries in, because they're so vastly different economically in how they handle things from countries with in the EU. Secondly, we think that there are also a lot of internal opposition to taking these countries for several reasons which are not likely to go away. Firstly, political and national reasons. Things such as Greeks and Northern Macedonia, not great pals, or as Tin rightfully pointed out, the fact that there has been a Yugoslav war. So a lot of these countries are not really so close with each other and don't want to join into a union together. Secondly, economic tensions. Some countries within the EU, especially in the eastern part of the EU, like Poland, actually benefit today from being the export countries of the EU, the ones with the cheap workforce that all the other countries like Germany buys cheap stuff from. They don't want this competition from another country that is going to be tariff exempt once it joins the EU. Thirdly, we think that every time the EU considers expanding even more eastwards, always the big, like elephant in the room, aka Russia, enters the chat. So they don't want to risk more tensions with Russia by expanding even more eastwards. And because of this risk aversion and not wanting to have more tensions, they are even more unlikely to want to take them in. Lastly, they just don't want another Article 7 headache. Given the so many issues they've had with Hungary and Poland so far, they just don't want another country that they might not be able to afterwards handle, that it has a problematic history with democracy. Before I move on, OG.
We cannot fear that these countries will be taken in. That takes out CG. The motion does fear that conditionality and negotiations continue. Therefore, all of the benefits of OG are literally fiated in the motion. Just thanks for taking out closing.
Okay. On that, cool. So here's the thing. OG shows us correlation, not causation. OG shows us that there's a degree of democratization happening in these countries. To an extent, I agree. The problem is they claim this happens because of the negotiations. Think of it just for a sec logically, and then I'm going to explain why I think it's not the reason. If indeed these countries were trying to democratize in order to join the EU, it's really weird to do it halfway through, to not actually fulfill the requirements of the EU in terms of transparency, but just lose on both ends. On the one hand, lose some of your grasp of control, but on the other hand, not join the EU. We think the actual reasons that this happens are incidental and going to be true anyway. A, because as Tin analyzed, these countries are post-Soviet and have an anti-Soviet sentiment and want to be more liberal and Western, independent of the EU. Secondly, because trade and influence also has an influence independent of joining the EU just because they are connecting. And lastly, because the people inside demand more liberties. We think that these are things that we stand to lose, however, if we associate them with with the EU. Because what happens if the EU continues like teasing with those countries and playing it as though they are getting there? Several things. Firstly, it means that eventually democracy is going to be seen as a failure, because after you try until eventually negotiations blow up because you realize they never really wanted to take you, you associate them as bad too. It's no longer us versus them in the sense of the Soviet versus the liberal West, but it's everyone against us. Secondly, it gives an excuse to authoritarian politicians to go against the liberal policies that are advancing recently and say that these were pushed by the EU and are no longer necessary. Lastly, it just leaves them much more desperate. Beg you to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and I welcome the government whip. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
I will have to delete this flag for this speech, however. Very sad react. It will not make sense. Okay, POIs in the chat. We'll take one 5:30. We'll take one from opening opposition. 3, 2, 1. Weighing. No one has done it. I will do it, then I will respond. Why do we weigh the lives of the Western Balkan people more than the lives of the people in the European Union, even if we are able to give them less money per person, accepting all of challenges in this debate? 2 reasons. Firstly, these people have been historically screwed over by the West, specifically during the Second World War, where we have been basically put under Russian influence for 45 years, where we have had a disgusting communist regime that led to things like death camps, that led to things, at least in my country, 3 economic crises, to led to things like control, how do you say, what was the word, like not corporate capture, but by the military forces and these sorts of things. Secondly, these people are poor. Notice, Bulgaria is currently the poorest country in the European Union. The lowest income wage is 350 euro. It is still bigger than the countries that are out of the European Union, such like Serbia, such as Albania, which is below 300 euro. This is very crucial here, because any additional funds that we're able to give to these sorts of people, any additional impact, even if it's on the comparative lower than what opening opposition states, it still has a drastic increase of the lives and standard of living of these sorts of individuals. This is why you should prioritize the life of a single person from the Western Balkans more than the person, from this sort of. We do now, this weighing will work if we're able to deal with the responses coming from both opposition cases that run the same case, by the way, and I will deal with this right now. Why will the European Union want to accept these countries? 5 responses. Number 1, there is a huge security problem with these countries constantly being able to be taken up by foreign powers like Russia, like China. The response we get is, but we're able to put forces in Ukraine. Ukraine is not the proper example here, because Ukraine is anti-Russian country. Serbia is very pro-Russian country, and also pro-China. The other countries are also susceptible to these sorts of things. The structural reason why Ukraine is anti-Russian is because they're literally to their doorstep and they're a constant threat of being attacked in these sorts of places. So this analogy doesn't stand. Note, it's too late to give structural analysis into it. So this is why they want to give this. Note, this is extremely important problem to neighbor states like Romania, like Bulgaria, who currently face extreme problem by Russian incursion, and this is likely to be a political impact there. Secondly, you gain political influence as the European Union because you get in total more votes that are in your control. So let's say the EPP wants to have more votes in order to push out its policy. If they get other member states in, they're able to create kingmakers and deadlocks within the parliament by influencing them in this sort of case. So there is a political vested interest. Thirdly, and here's where I put all. Note that there are currently, as per the framing of this debate, we're currently giving out money towards these sorts of places, but we don't have the accountability mechanisms that are all for this sort of thing. Meaning that on our side of the house, when we do accept them, we're able to put them in the court, as Naomi explains to you. We're able to do different things that are associated with controlling these sorts of places, so you're more likely to give to these sorts of cases. Then they say budgets. budgets aggregate over general policies. You're right, like that's how a parliament works. There are multiple parties, but in the end of the day, it comes like to a single concession decision, whether or not we want to spend more or access more. So having an additional party, they'll most likely concede to what is the majority opinion. It's not that problem. Then they say cheap war, how do you say, internal opposition, cheap workforce. Firstly, this over time changes. Notice, for example, when Bulgaria came into the European Union, yes, we were the cheap workforce, but then stuff like the IT sector cropped up, which is, how do you say, the best in the entire Balkans in Bulgarian context in this particular case. So you're actually able, this is, how do you say, a time-dependent thing. In a couple of years, it may not be the case as long as the other countries increase their revenue and someone needs to slide back to the lower ends, which is where you get the poor people to work on the slave force. Then they say Russia. Firstly, Russia is at maximum encroachment capacity right now. They will do anything symmetrically to influence these countries on our side of the house. The only difference is on our side, we're able to influence them back. You're not being comparative. This destroys closing opposition. They have to respond to all of this in order to have their extension. How do we then deal with opening opposition? Opening opposition runs a similar case. And here I want to explain why they beat opening government. Firstly, opening government's mechanisms, and don't let them get away with this, which is to say, we're able to get benefits from the process. No, you're not. These benefits are reversible in this debate. They're able to be taken back in this sort of case if they decide to not engage with this particular regards. So they're not able to do this. Secondly, these benefits are not as big as joining the European Union in this particular case, but being an adequate member in the European Union. Here is where opening opposition gets two very good responses that they do not respond back. And I'll respond to in a second and explain why they win this debate, but before, sure, opening up.
Unlike CO, our impacts stand regardless of EU buy-in. Unlike OG, we explained why investment and democratization happen on either side of the house and the harms of the accession process outweigh. Please explain to me why your long-term extension on outcomes takes the two.
Okay, look, on the first thing I already engaged to you, we flip it because it's worse on your side of the house. CO, I don't need to defend them therefore. Let's continue with your case. You say something very important in this debate, and that is that currently, there are structural reasons that make so that these countries do not want to join the EU. So that means that all of the laundry list of reasons are applied in general to the local population in this particular case. Thus, if the corrupt elite does not want to just join the EU, it doesn't matter if all of the 7 mechanisms outline that you want to join the EU, because these people are able to control themselves in this particular regards. This is something that they will never respond to. I will respond to right now with my 4 mechanisms. Firstly, there is a general increase of, how do you say, people protesting and being anti-corruption in these types of states. This is due to structural reasons. Firstly, newer, younger generation that has access to social media technology, knows what happens in the West, and want more liberties associated with this particular regards. Secondly, opportunistic other politicians who have, how do you say, capitalized through different powers, like for example, their lawyers or businessmen, etc., who are against the current power structures, will also rally up these protests, create oppositional parties, and go into these, how do you say, places. Thirdly, these people have lived, how do you say, under the circumstances of the very problematic age between this. Not necessarily communism, but all the years that are after communism that are associated with the corruption in these particular cases. This means that there's likely to be a moment where the governments shift in these type of, how do you say, countries, and they're likely to be more pro-European Union in these sorts of cases. This is an extremely important link in this debate, because as opening opposition state, either you don't join at all, or you join as a corrupt member and you're able to reap all of the benefits, and the power structures continue, leading to the situation which is in my country, where we're currently EU member states, but the same power structure exists. Thus, in order to access any benefit in this debate about the, how do you say, the existence of the European Union, you have to get rid of that government in particular. We proved to you structurally why they will get rid of this government, and we get the benefits because we continue the process. For all these reasons, CJ.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and to close the debate, I welcome the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
You are.
Cool, give me one sec. Okay. Okay, can I take POIs in the chat, please? Okay. Right. Where's my? Okay, there we go. Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Just saying that we're derivative doesn't prove that we are. What we do is we actually analyze why these countries won't join the EU, and we give harms to those countries as a result. What are the harms that Hadar talks about in her speech? I think there are 4 to identify. 3 maybe. Firstly, I think the infrastructure policies that these groups now have to invest in, and opening government themselves say this, by the way, actually end up harming these countries' economies. Why? Because oftentimes these policies only have a very long-term payoff, and probably only have a payoff if they join the EU, i.e. building trade infrastructure, for example, is only valuable in so far as you then end up joining the EU and can exploit that infrastructure. But if they never join the EU in the way that Hadar suggests, this is just a sunk cost and wasted money that could have been allocated in a much better way. Secondly, they lose alternatives, because insofar as they're negotiating with the EU, and insofar as the EU has these specific conditions which it imposes upon these countries, that means they can't turn as much to the same extent as groups like China or groups like Russia, for example, people who would posit a meaningful alternative to these groups and they can play them off against each other. So when you don't have these negotiations, you don't get as good of a deal. Thirdly, it leads to a massive rise of anti-Western sentiment, because at a certain point in time, these countries are going to realize that actually the situation is pretty fucked. They're never going to join the EU in the first place, which means that they've kind of wasted their whole time playing with an actor that never really acted in good faith in the first place. I think what that leads to is a few different outcomes. Firstly, it means that once these negotiations fail, these countries are in a very weak position, and that's when they fall into the hands of actors such as Russia, for example, who can then offer them some sort of recovery from this. Then it also gives them a justification to oppose all of the democratization measures that opening government want, because insofar as these measures are then associated with the EU, which is seen as this really negative actor, then they probably don't want to engage with them to the same extent. Weighing this against opening opposition, the first mechanism of weighing that I have is that I want to note that the opening opposition case relies on numerous points of failure. Firstly, they need to rely on the fact that the money actually goes in the way they want, i.e. supporting these southern countries. They never proved that. Secondly, they rely on proving that this money is actually a meaningful tipping point for these southern economies, and they don't really prove that either. They depend on all of these things which are left unproven, and I don't think there are some suggest it wouldn't, like for example the fact that Germany is very pro-austerity, for example. We don't rely on these points of failure because we don't rely on the actions of an institution that are very myriad and complex to explain. We just give you certain harms in the form of these economies. So our case is more likely. But secondly, I know just on the basis of risk aversion, they give you a bunch of speculative benefits that might occur to the EU or speculative harms that might occur to the EU in the long run. We give you a certain harm that will accrue to these countries now, and I would posit that if you're risk averse, you ought to care about that significantly more than some speculative benefit that only occurs in the long run. All right, weighing then against opening government, basically. So what are the reasons they give you for joining the EU? I think it's largely internal bottom-up demand that exists. And as Hadar identifies, you only get this, you only join the EU only if the EU necessarily supports this. This is incredibly unlikely because we're talking about the same EU where the dominant power is anti-expansion as it doesn't want to pay for more countries that, like in the Southern Europe, for example. We're talking about the same EU where each individual country has a veto on someone joining or not, which means that actually the odds of getting in are massively limited because any single country can throw a spanner in the works. We're talking about the same EU that has geopolitical opposition to some of these countries in the way that Hadar suggests. Now, I want to be very clear about which impacts on opening government rely on joining the EU and which impacts do not. Most of the economic benefits they give you either depend on joining the EU, in the example of free trade agreements, for example, which we can get on outside the house, or they depend on joining the EU, i.e. the euro. I think the reality is that these countries are largely self-interested, and they have a problem here because opening government identify a viable alternative which exists for these countries in the form of China, which can give them lots of money, for example. And it's unclear to me as to why they wouldn't choose China over the EU. Like, yes, they might not choose Russia. But insofar as China is also an alternative, they might actually opt into that because those trades are much less tied in the way that they suggest. The second benefit they talk about geostrategic impacts also don't depend upon joining on these negotiations necessarily, because the EU probably still cares about its eastern border, for example, but still probably want to ensure stability there, which means they have an incentive to continue negotiations with these groups. And so that doesn't depend necessarily on trying to join the EU in the first place. I think the main comparative benefit they have is this idea of civil society and democratization and NGO oversight and so on. I think that there are a few responses here. Firstly, democratization happens anyway for the reasons that we get down government bench. The idea of the anti-Soviet sentiment, the idea that closing government have about the social contract that exists in these places and that breaking down would presumably mean that democratization happens to some extent anyway. Secondly, though, I think the requirements the EU give are not necessarily beneficial insofar as they're very universal and like one size fits all, and they may not particularly suit the country overall. Thirdly, I would note that these requirements are probably temporary band-aids, right? That aren't structural reforms, i.e. all they are is holding a few legitimate elections, and then after that anything can happen, and it's very easy to engage in backsliding, and indeed that backsliding is likely for the reasons that Hadar suggests about how you go back on this when you see that the EU was really a bad actor. So I think that then for all of these reasons, it's actually incredibly likely or unclear the extent to which these democratic benefits exist, and they're likely to erode in the long term for the reasons that Hadar suggests. Before I talk about closing government, I'll take a POI from OG.
The EU overseeing elections, investing in infrastructure, providing development funds, which happens independently of whether countries join, and therefore your material on EU buy-in, are the mechanisms by which people connect the process of democratization to palpable benefits, and therefore buy into these long-term processes.
But as I said before, is that yes, the EU might endorse one election, but you have to weigh that against all of the subsequent elections to be rigged in the way that Hadar suggests, and on a weighing mechanism, you probably ought to prioritize our material. Okay, lastly then on closing government, I'm going to be very, very charitable to them and say that maybe the reason they give as to why the EU will accept these countries is because of the economic benefits they give. I don't think this necessarily works though, because that's contingent upon proving that the EU is primarily caring about these sorts of speculative economic benefits. I think this is incredibly unlikely, because I think that the EU probably prioritizes its own geostrategic sense, or the idea of not wanting any sort of political gridlock that might exist for these countries, given the bad experience they've had prior with Poland and Hungary and so on. So yes, maybe their analysis about why this EU will accept might be true if the EU was like a perfectly rational actor, but I don't think it is a perfectly rational actor. I know that insofar as every single country has a veto, only one country needs to oppose this for these people to not get into the EU, and I think that's incredibly likely for the reasons we've suggested. The second thing they talk about is this idea of like social contract and wanting some sort of economic benefits. I think if anything, that just proves that in the absence of the EU negotiating with them, these authoritarians will continue to lose power to some meaningful extent, and so you get a sort of process of democratization on our side. It's very unclear as to why. Like, if that's true, surely that would just mean that distrust in these governments and these governments lose support over time if they aren't able to join the EU and get the economic benefits that exist. At the end of this debate, we prove these countries never join the EU, which means they turn massively against it in the long run. Very proud to stand in closing opposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for that fine speech, and indeed all of you for that debate. We are going to go judge. We will tell you the result when we have the result.